Hi, Scott.
Hey, Robert, how's it going?
I cannot complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Scott Barry Kaufman, well-known psychologist. You're teaching psychology at Barnard College now. You're, I would say, loosely associated or maybe firmly associated with positive psychology, but to some extent associated. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's definitely fair to say. Yep.
And you write a column for Scientific American called Beautiful Minds.
Yep, it's now a weekly column.
Uh-huh.
I have to up my writing game.
Well, there's a lot of beautiful minds out there. I think it'll be a while before you run out. Yeah, you host the psychology podcast.
Yep, that's also weekly, and we tend to release new episodes on Thursdays. And
I've been on. Thank you for that. And you've been on Meaning of Life TV. I don't think you've ever been on my show, but you've been on Meaning of Life TV, the platform which this will appear on. The video incarnation of this will be on Meaning of Life TV. Great.
Yeah, I had a great chat with David Yaden for his own channel, on Meaning of Life TV. But it's a total honor to be able to talk to Robert Wright on Meaning of Life TV. You've made it when ...
Oh, I'm honored by your honoredness. Or maybe I should say humbled. I've never understood why people say humbled when something great. It's like, I won the Academy Award. I'm so humbled. Humbled? That's the opposite. Don't you get it?
I don't believe in humbled. I really believe in self-respect, and you're allowed to be proud. You're allowed to have a healthy pride for what you've accomplished in an earned fashion.
I don't get the logic of even wanting to fool people into thinking that you're humbled. I don't understand what that logic would be. Anyway. So what book of yours do you generally plug when it comes to book plugging?
Well, my most recent book is Wired to Create, Unraveling the Mysteries of the Creative Mind. My baby of a book was released in 2013. That's called Ungifted Intelligence Redefined. So either those two are good.
And actually, that's not a bad segue. There's a connection between intelligence, the concept, and intelligence testing, and the main thing we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about self-actualization, this concept associated with Abraham Maslow. If we have time, we're going to talk about, we will at least touch on something that isn't quite the opposite of self-actualization, but is certainly darker. It's called the dark core. I've also heard a related thing called the dark triad.
Yeah, we should
talk about that briefly.
We should get into those finer differentiations.
Okay, but it's basically.
I don't know why my eyebrows always go up when someone says dark triad. What does that mean? I'm like, dark triad. I don't know why my eyes do that.
That's a tell. That means that that means that you are possessed by the dark triad and you need an exorcism.
No, it doesn't. That's not true. But I think it means that I find that intriguing. I think that's the more plausible explanation.
That's the charitable explanation. In any event, so the dark triad is like this. It's kind of a personality type. It's a conglomeration of a number of kind of negative traits or something. Is that?
Yeah. Yes. Do you want to jump into that already?
Let's touch on dark triad or dark core, and then go into self-actualization. I mean, let me say one thing because I talked about that segue about between intelligence and self-actualization, because I think it probably applies to the dark triad as well, which is that in intelligence testing, there's something called G. Well, there is this idea that it is meaningful to talk about people having intelligence in some general sense. I mean, without being too essentialist about it. And I'm personally agnostic. I haven't looked into the literature. I don't know if I buy it, but a lot of people in the field would argue that it is meaningful to talk about kind of a general aptitude we can call intelligence. And what they would point to as validation is the fact that if you look at people's scores on a number of different kinds of tests that test some aspect of intelligence, there tends to be a correlation among those tests, right? Is that the basic logic?
Well, let me give a little primer on G.
Okay.
That's how I started. I started my career studying general intelligence and IQ testing, and it is undeniable that if you administer a reasonably large number of cognitive tests that are reasonably challenging, that this G factor will emerge as a statistical phenomenon. So just saying, if you look at the first, like which is the factor that explains the most variance in the data set, or explains, is like that kind of pervades all the items, you do find a substantial general factor of cognitive ability. So the existence of the general factor is not in dispute, and I think any reasonable intelligence researcher has to admit that statistical phenomenon exists across cultures, across it's a fascinating sort of, Christopher Chabris calls it the law of general intelligence, that statistical thing is going to emerge if you have no matter what, if you have a sufficient diverse set of cognitive tasks. What is in dispute is whether or not G is a cause, or it just reflects the outcome of or a summary score of your intelligence across lots of different cognitive tasks. So when you actually get into the nitty-gritty debates within the field, that's where the debate is like, there's this emerging view that intelligence is not a thing. Like, we shouldn't reify it. Like, we shouldn't reify general intelligence.
You shouldn't essentialize it.
Robert has a high general intelligence, which causally that's why he's so successful in life, as opposed to, well, we can find your G score, your G factor score, Robert, but that would just be a reflective latent variable, not one that determines or is causal. And so it gets really nerdy, these debates, and some people will be like, oh, who cares, but it is actually important. It does have a lot of practical implications in how we think about nurturing intelligence and developing in all people. If we, instead of thinking of it as this thing you either were born with, or you weren't born with, or this trait you have that is one single number that is causing everything, versus like, what can we do to develop a whole system of things that then reflect on your G score? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I should say, if I've left people kind of on the edge of their seats about what the connection is here, you have recently done some work where you developed a kind of a scale or something. You're arguing that self-actualization can be thought of as a thing. We'll get to what that is, but if you don't know, but Maslow famously defined it, and I think most people would say it's something worth having, although that turns out to be more complicated than you might imagine. But anyway, you're arguing, as I understand it, that testing the correlations among answers on tests or something suggests that we can speak of there being a thing called self-actualization, somewhat as we can speak of there being a thing like intelligence. And you actually developed this. And I took the test, and we can talk about my...
What was your score? Let's talk about it.
Let's wait a second. No, I mean, I'm not like an expert on keeping people tuned into your podcast, but I do know this. Never disclose your self-actualization score at the very beginning of the podcast.
I love that.
The first rule of podcasting.
That's true. Let's leave them on the edge of their seats.
Yeah. So, but anyway, so that's the parallel we're talking about. Can I ask one question, though, about the general logic here? I mean, well, with intelligence, we're talking about correlations among what kinds of dimensions?
Cognitive tests, cognitive ability.
Like spatial orientation.
So a whole array of things that tap into a sort of problem-solving, abstraction, analogical thinking sort of form of human cognition. So it could range from vocabulary tests to verbal reasoning tests. We have to actually do verbal analogies, to spatial analogies. Like you have to look at a lot of nonverbal patterns and say, well, what completes this pattern? And that's a very popular indicator of general intelligence. To actually mentally rotating in 3D certain things.
Now that I did terribly on. I mean, not terribly, but I was in the 35th percent in high school. Yeah. Spatial relations, like you would see a two-dimensional thing with dots on it, where you could fold it, and then they would say, which object would this fold into? I was in the 35th percentile in spatial relation. And let's don't get off on this, but I've sometimes thought that a deficiency like that can have its actual virtues.
It can.
And I think it leads to certain other things I have that I'm glad I have. But anyway, let's not dwell on that.
No, but I'm with like you. I mean, when I was really young, very, very young, I was actually in special education. I don't know if I said actually. I mean, I was in special education and for an auditory disability. But I think that for some reason, like it might have been tied somewhat to my visual spatial deficits, because when I, like they looked at my average IQ score when I was young, and it wasn't anything to write home about, and I think they thought I was like needed academic remediation, but I was so bored in remediating classes. Well, only a couple of years ago did I get my adult IQ tested by a friend of mine who studies this. He also scanned my brain. And it was interesting, interesting to understand like what was going on as a kid. And I wish like school psychologists took more of it into account, is that the real information wasn't in my G score. It wasn't in my total IQ score. It was looking at the huge asymmetry of the subscale scores. So my, abstract reasoning abilities and verbal reasoning abilities were very, very much above average. But my spatial, three-dimensional block task, there's this task where they give you like a picture diagram and then they give you blocks and they say recreate this. I was like, I don't know how to do this.
That was the test that I did badly on.
So hard. Yeah. So me and you are similar along those lines. But looking at that scatter of scores, it's interesting because the psychologist said to me, I wish I could have tested you when you were 9 or 10 years old. I would have told you you're verbally gifted. I would have taken some strength from that battery, and we would have built on it, as opposed to I went through many years of.
Now it's funny, you are musically very skilled, right? Is it singing or is it's singing, right?
Yeah, that should not have happened either. I actually was a professional opera singer for a couple of years, went to school for vocal performance as an undergrad before I switched to psychology. And I had, my learning disability was auditory processing disorder. So it's like, what is going on there,
Odd.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So self-actualization.
So yeah, there's questions I could ask about the whole methodology of what the question of what you can and can't assert on the basis of correlations. Well, let me ask one quickly: is there anything circular about it? In other words, if I came up with some test that, in some sense, tests your intelligence, like suppose, to take an obviously odd example, it was like about plants you find in the Amazonian jungle, and it was like, do you recognize this plant or something? And of course, there wouldn't be a correlation between that and general intelligence. And the intelligence testers would exclude it.
Yeah.
But aren't they kind of excluding it because it doesn't correlate? In other words, I assume that if there's a certain kind of test that doesn't correlate, they just say, well, then that's not part of it. I mean, in other words, you can always find different kinds of tests that correlate. And I guess you can give a name to what, like intelligence to whatever they supposedly collectively measure. I don't know. Does this make any sense?
Oh, totally. You're really asking what are the boundary conditions of these different constructs, and it's a great question. And there's deep philosophical implications here that go way beyond like even psychology and statistical analysis. We as psychologists, we just name we're the ones who name constructs. I mean, it was Charles Spearman who named it general intelligence. An alien coming in from another, planet would probably could look at that first principle. All it is like statistically the first principal component of a bunch of cognitive ability tests, and might see something different there that's measuring. It was just Charles Spearman who called it G, the general factor. It's just me that's calling it self-actualization because that's what Maslow called it, and I wanted to be in the spirit of Maslow. But actually, I think what he was measuring was not self-actualization. I actually think that a better name for it is self-transcendent, the self-transcendent scale. But I wanted to really be the spirit of what Maslow, what he called it, whatever people know that name, Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that, and we'll link to the column in which you write about it on Scientific American, which in turn I think links to some of the actual academic work you've done on it. And if not, we'll link to those independently. But so people probably encountered this in Psych 101. You did when I was an undergraduate. It was Maslow's hierarchy of needs was the way it was put. It was often visualized as a pyramid, although, as you note in your column, Maslow himself never drew a pyramid to depict the concept. But the idea is that your needs are hierarchical in the sense that, like, you start with the ones you need to actually survive, need food, need to satisfy your hunger drive, and so on. And then once you got that done, so to speak, next things you'd want are involved, human, contact, whatever. Anyway, he goes kind of up the scale in some sense toward something called self-actualization, right? Now, why don't you either correct me or flesh out what I said, or a little of both?
Well, that's how it's taught in introductory psychology classes. Mm-hmm. But as early as I can identify, as early as the early 60s, and he died in 1970, in the early 60s, he really was starting to question that self-actualization was the height of his hierarchy. What he proposed was a hierarchy of prepotency of needs. He never said that you must, in order to get to the next level. It's not like a video game, you get to the next level only until you unlock, the level below it. And then once you unlock it, you never go back to the prior level. He did not conceptualize that way. He had written explicitly that he did not view it as a lockstep progression of development, but we're constantly toggling back and forth between these various, stages or prepotent attention on these various needs. Like at certain parts in our life, if we're very deprived of connection, for instance, we will have our dominant perceptions, like everything around us will feed into that. We'll want to, what's this person's utility for helping me reach my connection? But he distinguished between two main classes of needs, and that's what I wanted to focus on, which I think is much more interesting than the hierarchy, which is how.
And what are the two classes?
Yeah, so he argued there's the deficiency needs realm of human cognition, and then there's this being realm. So the deficiency realm are, when we're stuck in that deficiency realm, like everything. Oh, I'm like food in my mouth. Okay.
the second rule of podcasting.
Okay.
Never start a podcast with food in your mouth. And if you do, try to expel it within the first 10 minutes.
I didn't expect
It's surprising. It's just too surprising if someone's been talking for 15 minutes.
I know. Well, we're going to come up with it. That's going to be like the Easter egg of this podcast, or like the 10 things you shouldn't do.
Was it an actual Easter egg, by the way, that was in your mouth? No, it was something small.
I hope to gosh not. Not eat an Easter egg. The deficiency realm of human cognition, where our perceptions are like we demand the world to be a certain way to satisfy our needs, like whether it's like the need for physiological, like feed me or love me or respect me. Okay, so that's the deficiency realm. But he argued that once we can really get that under control and get those needs satisfied to a reasonable degree, then we enter this being realm of human cognition, where we do not try to. He argues it's kind of like taking a clouded lens off and replacing it with a clear lens, that we suddenly see the world as it is, not as we are trying to impart our desires onto it.
Now, this I am immediately reminded of like being on a meditation retreat, or the whole idea of kind of Buddhist meditation, or part of the idea at least.
Very much influenced by Buddhist thinking towards the end of his life.
Yeah. That's interesting, because the idea is that defensiveness warps your perception, kind of. Always like worrying about what people are thinking about you, or fearing that they're actually going to do something to you, or say something about you, or get the job you want, or whatever. Defensiveness in all these senses kind of warps and narrows your perception. And then meditation, especially mindfulness meditation, maybe is a discipline that helps you transcend that and see the world more clearly.
Yeah, you write about that beautifully in your book, and in fact, I'm working on a book right now, and I quote something you say along those lines in the book. Yeah, I want to make it very clear that like people depict Maslow's theory as ending in self-actualization, and there's a lot of things that introductory psychology textbooks get wrong about what Maslow actually thought about and wrote about this stuff, and especially the last 5 to 7 years of his life, he was so influenced by Eastern philosophy. And he made an encounter with Esalen Institute in near San Francisco, and his eyes really opened up to what he was really studying his whole life wasn't self-actualization. He realized it was these peak experiences where we get outside of ourselves, and so he was very much into that near the end.
Was his interest in self-transcendence something that developed later in his life? Yes, absolutely. And he, right up to the day he died, he was working on this new theory that I really want to be back on your podcast when my book comes out a year and a half from now. So I'm going to leave some mysteries open, if that makes sense. Excellent idea. People are marking their calendars right now out in podcast land. They're calculating. Let's see, 18 months from now. I want to make sure I'm not busy that day. So we'll do that. Let me quote something that you say he wrote in a 1961 paper, Peak Experiences as Acute Identity Experiences. He writes, the goal of identity, self-actualization in parentheses. Now that's interesting. So self-actualization is like a fully developed identity, but then that's not the end of the game, so to speak, right? It's like once you have a fully I'll read the whole quote and just quit getting my
the whole quote, or is I trying to get this video to actually make me look like me?
Okay, yeah, you work on that. You work on your visual identity, and I will read this. The goal of identity, self-actualization, seems to be simultaneously an end goal in itself and also a transitional goal, a rite of passage, a step along the path to the transcendence of identity. This is like saying its function is to erase itself. Put the other way around, if our goal is the Eastern one of ego transcendence and obliteration, of leaving behind self-consciousness and self-observation, then it looks as if the best path to this goal for most people is via achieving identity, a strong real self, and via basic need gratification. So you fill your basic needs, you actualize yourself, and so have a fully constructed identity. We can talk a little about what that means, but it's after that that one might move further toward toward transcending the very identity, in a sense, that you have now constructed.
If you've done it right, that if you've done it right, self-actualization is only a bridge. It is only a bridge to self-transcendence. The problem is a lot of people really took his theory, and you see it applied in business schools and in education, and they're just stopping there at the self-actualization. It is a sort of very individualistic pursuit that's not tied to the needs of others or tied to fulfilling a function, in society. And he really became clear, very sure, especially towards the end of his life, that is a misuse of his theory.
Okay.
People don't know that. People don't know that. I've yet to read an introductory psychology textbook that accurately conveys what he actually thought.
It's funny the way these things get stuck in Psych 101 textbooks, and then it seems like the subsequent writers of textbooks just copy whatever was in the first one.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I mean, in a different kind of thing is the recent work on the Stanford prison experiment that has shown that generations have been misled about what that was exactly about and what it actually showed. But we have a podcast I did with a guy who did a lot of work on that we can talk about. But so that's interesting. It's like, so to some extent, the ego is something that exists. Does it almost inherently exist in a context of defensiveness? I mean, it reminds me of the way, we're hearing a lot about nationalism, and the idea of a national identity, a national ego, seems to be reinforced by, cultivating fear, a sense of defensiveness.
Yeah. It's interesting, question, because there's more definition. There's just as many definitions of ego as there are for the self, in hundreds and hundreds. But
right.
But I personally, that's how I like to draw the lines around these concepts. The ego to me is that defensive self. And I think that's a good working definition. I'm really interested in this line of research called the quiet ego research, where we don't get rid of our ego. The ego serves a useful function. It's not it's something that I would argue we should completely get rid of or ignore. But we should harness it for whole person growth. I feel like we need to not get rid of our dark side, but or act as though that's not part of who we are or part of us, but we should healthfully integrate it into our creative pursuits. That's what I'm really into.
Okay. So would Maslow say that if you're self-actualized, I presume you are embedded in a social network, right? You've got, I think for him, part of self-actualization is even having a mate, right? So it's kind of like you do the normal things that we expect as part of social development and personal development, and then you're kind of self-actualized. I mean, if that's more, what's that?
Did you say mate? M-A-T-E?
Yeah, doesn't he say like mate acquisition?
So here's the thing. Douglas Kenrick is an evolutionary psychologist who tried to revamp Maslow's hierarchy of needs, built on an evolutionary foundation, and that's how he revamped it. He actually put in parenting. He cut self-actualization and put parenting at the top of the pyramid, and mating retention was the second to last, and then mating acquisition was the. Anyway, I am not a big fan of that revamp.
Maslow didn't get into that at all.
Not really. He, in fact, he put sex at the physiological stage. So I have quibbles with where Maslow put sex, and I have quibbles with this revamping on an evolutionary foundation. We can get into where sex and mating should belong in a hierarchy. That's a very interesting topic I'm interested in as well.
Now we said so. In other words, sex would be nearer the bottom of the pyramid that, of course, again, Maslow never drew. But is that what you mean when you say he categorized it as physiological?
Yeah. So whenever the two instances I've ever been able to identify, and I've read like everything this guy wrote, he just says in passing, like, sex is a physiological need, like food, and he just puts that in there. But Kenrick is the one who really put it all much more at the top from an evolutionary perspective.
I see. Yeah. So that's revised Maslow. But I guess one question is, so would Maslow say that, like, let's suppose you haven't actualized yourself, like you're a loner, you don't have any friends, whatever. Would he say you can't then go off and like meditate in the Himalayas for a month and transcend yourself, because you actually have to construct a more or less, normal identity first?
Well, why don't we look at it in the way that that I'm looking at it in terms of the scale I developed? Mm-hmm. Because it's not a hierarchy. It's just these are just characteristics that we should that self-actualized people cultivate. And I think that's probably a better way of thinking about it right now. Is that it's not like you, like I said, it's not like a video game, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like you get the connection and love and sex, and then you go to the meditation retreat,
Right. I mean, he does describe identity, the attainment of full identity, as this kind of transitional state, but I guess he's not saying you necessarily have to pass through it. It's just the way it's normally done.
He's including a paradox that really consumed him the last couple of years of his life, which I think is a really interesting paradox, actually. And that's that in the self-actualized individuals that he studied, it seems like they were more likely than non-self-actualized individuals to self-transcend themselves. So this is something that really kind of perplexed him. He's like, why is it that those who have the strongest identities are those who are most likely to experience peak experiences, which is what a lot of people, experience on meditation retreats, for instance.
Right.
So that is what really captured his interest.
But isn't the answer something we've just touched on, kind of, which is that, well, what is the answer? I mean, it has to do with ego being a thing that is constructed in a context of defense. I mean, if you've got a sense of identity that is so robust that you're not playing defense, then it stands to reason that you're more open to self-transcendence for reasons we've described. Just the way on a meditation retreat you slowly get liberated from all the sources of defensiveness in your life, and that's what opens you up.
So relating to what you just said, Maslow, when he wrote about peak experiences, there's this great quote. I almost wish I could find it right now real quick so I don't do it injustice. But there's this great quote where he says, the way I conceptualize peak experiences are temporary states of self-actualization. So he argued that when he started studying peak experiences, he stopped talking about self-actualization as a thing you achieve, like forever, like he actually started to view it more as like a state than a trait, as like, because early in his career, he really viewed it as a trait. And then he started to realize that, wow, there are these moments of peak experiences. Maybe it's through a joyous, transcendent sexual experience. Maybe it's through music, the flow of music, art, painting, doing, creating something. Or he's, interestingly enough, he argued maybe, women in childbirth tend to sometimes experience these. And then David Ian and I actually confirmed that scientifically, that was the biggest other category.
It's funny you should mention that, because we did these mashups on Meaning of Life TV. We haven't posted them yet, but where we go around asking people around the country like a series of questions, and each mashup has a theme. Like, have you ever experienced the divine was one, and I think 2 different women mentioned childbirth as an experience of the divine.
Yeah, it's undeniable in our data sets now, and it's so fascinating that Maslow like scribbled that down on a piece of paper as a potential major trigger of those experiences. So I think that from a trait perspective, I think the way we're thinking about traits these days, like William Fleason's doing great work on this, is that traits are just density distributions of states. Now, okay, I'll explain what that means. So, like we think of personality as like, if you're like a moral person, you're always moral. That's not true. When you look at people in their everyday lives and you look at and you add up, all we are is just this kind of like summation of our moment to moment experiences. That's all personality is. So really, like, there's no such thing as a completely virtuous person. They haven't been found in any data set. Like, if you actually look through the lives of someone who scores high on the personality trait of like morality, all that means from a density distribution perspective is they tend to have more 4 and 5s during the course of their day on like a 5-point scale, right? They just tend to have more of those experiences during the course of.
Wait, what's a 4 or 5 in this context?
High or very high.
High in
like moral behaviors or the feeling of the feeling of generosity.
But you're right. I think the finding is that how good you behave. I mean, there was a famous Good Samaritan experiment right near where I am. It was conducted at Princeton Theological Seminary. Do you know this? Like 40 years ago.
Genovese is her name. Yeah.
What's that?
I think her name's Kitty Genovese or something like that.
No, that was an anecdotal thing. That was an actual murder that happened in New York. But they did an experiment at psychologists who I think were at Princeton did an experiment at Princeton. It's maybe that's a little tangential. I'll make it fast. But they these people didn't know they were in an experiment. These theology students, what they said to them was, okay, you've got to go over and give a talk. And here's what the talk is on. As it happens, not ironically, but as a almost joke, the talk was on the Good Samaritan, at least for some of them. Then on their way to the talk, they had planted a person who seemed to be in need. They were lying on the sidewalk, coughing. They looked like they're dying. And the question is, will this person stop to help them? And the key variable turned out to be, before you send the student off to give the talk, do you say, you're late? You've got to, you've got to be there. You got to get to talk in 2 minutes. Or do you say, okay, the talk doesn't actually start for 20 minutes. Well, the people who were late just said, screw you to the person who seemed to be dying on the sidewalk. And the people who weren't late didn't. And that was a much stronger predictor than anything in any personality test they gave these people. So that's kind of what you mean, right? I mean, morality is a very situational thing.
Yes, I'm not saying it's completely situational. I'm saying there are genetic predispositions and there are environmental influences that influence the average. Like we can, for instance, I'm very interested in the highs of the heights of human experience as well as the lows. I think there's some really interesting research by Daniel Nell showing that if you go in some neighborhoods that are constantly they're unpredictable and there's a lot of mortality salience in the environment, like people are dying around you, so your life is uncertain. The average of everyone in that community is high distrust. Some some of these kind of dark triad traits, on average, you tend to see higher levels of those traits. So I think there are situational components that can influence the average of all the.
Absolutely, and can influence your risk aversion, your willingness to take risk, which in turn feeds into criminality and so on. But
very interested in that, yes.
So let's do cut to the chase. I mean, first of all, you're saying we should not think of this really as this sequence of things you go, stages of, like going through stages of school. You should just think of self-actualization more as like having dimensions. Is that?
For now, until 2020, when I tell you what I really think.
Okay.
But for now, yes, I like what you said. I think that my life's mission has been to show that we have greater potential than, like, especially it started with kids, and I was very interested in education. Like, I think kids have a lot of more potential and possibilities than they realize and the teachers realize. Especially I was interested in kids with learning disabilities, right? So what I think this test is like, it's a nice kind of alternative or supplement to the IQ test, which is the predominant method of potential in schools. Mm-hmm. But what if in addition, or even instead of focusing so exclusively on a person's intellectual potential, we actually look at their potential for these 10 characteristics. I think these are characteristics that, regardless of who you are and in what way you want to self-actualize, they're going to be helpful.
Okay.
So should we discuss your score on the 10?
Yeah. Well, let me read the 10 characteristics, because I gather these characteristics are things that I gather Maslow had mentioned, and you have found that there is correlation is there correlation among scores on these? Oh,
yes. That was a criteria that I used. Right. In order to, there had to be an S factor.
Okay. So this is the S factor for self-actualization is found in, the idea of that is based on actual correlation among people's results on tests that gauge these things: continued freshness of appreciation, acceptance, authenticity, equanimity, purpose. You mentioned your mission in life, a sense of purpose, efficient perception of reality. There, a sample item would be, I am always trying to get at the real truth about people and nature. Humanitarianism, peak experiences. So you're actually folding that into self-actualization. Good moral intuition, creative spirit. So I took the test that gauges these 10 things, and I have to admit that I am below average in self-actualization. Now I gotta say, though,
did you look at your facets? Okay, well, sorry.
Yeah. I've got the dimensions. I mean, I've got. I can tell you what I can go down the scale and tell you what I was high in. It's pretty predictable. But I will say, I mean, and I'm sure you would concede, these depend on self-report, right?
Yes.
So these are like the way you gauge. And of course, we psychologists have established that people tend to have a somewhat warped conception of themselves. Most people think that they are better than most people at all kinds of things. There is this bias, especially when it comes to kind of goodness, kind of moral. Most people think they're above average. So there's that. And I would say in this, one of the dimensions was, I don't know where this comes in, but there were some questions that tapped into how hard are you on yourself? How self-critical are you? And I said, I'm very, very much, I think I am. But then I wonder, like, what's that?
Self-accepting.
Yeah, but if I'm critical on myself, couldn't that affect the way I'm rating myself on the other dimension? As you can see, I'm trying to talk myself into being not really below average on self-actualization, even though the test says I am below average. I was in the third.
Very high. Would you have not protested or?
No, I would be offering to blurb your survey.
Like, I love your test so much.
Yeah, man, this makes the SAT look like whatever. The
you got a 30-something%. Is that what you're going to say?
39.
Okay, so I would love to hear the subscale scores.
By the way, what did you get?
Well, it's funny because I didn't create a test in order to have a test that I would score high on.
However, coincidentally,
I did score higher. I think higher than 80% or so. Not off the charts. I didn't score perfect.
Isn't that funny?
But I took it earnestly. I think
this warrants an investigation. I think some sort of
an independent investigation. Well, the thing is, there are independent investigators now. I welcome that very much. They're translated into German right now, and they're going to be measuring this in Germany and as association to meaning. The Values and Action Institute is going to be looking at correlations between the scale and character strengths, and and things. So, I absolutely would love independent verification. Yeah, but I mean, I didn't. I did a statistical analysis, but I did score. I did score higher than average, and that made me feel good in the sense that, like, these IQ tests my whole life, right? Like, I've felt stupid, like, even like standardized tests, I never did well. And I always had to like write these personal essays to colleges and things like, please, like, there are other dimensions of me that are not being appreciated in students and things. So yes, in one sense, I guess it is like kind of the grand existential, revenge of the nerd, but it's, I don't know, but I didn't like, I did a scientific analysis. I really did.
I trust you.
Thanks. You can see the data.
So anyway, the two things that I did that I guess perfectly on in a certain sense, which just means I rated myself high on them. One is what is it, efficient perception of reality? Is that it?
Yeah. Which, problematic subscale, but yeah.
Yeah, but because that does depend on, I think some of the questions were about, do you try to get to the bottom of things? And some were actually rating your ability to see things clearly, right? And
yeah.
So I'm sorry, this is kind of embarrassing that I rate myself so high on some of these things, but I do. Purpose,
don't be embarrassed.
What's that?
Don't be embarrassed. You should be proud because you've really trained yourself. The whole book was about your earnest attempt to see reality more clearly. So I wouldn't be embarrassed by it. I would have authentic pride for it.
Okay. Well, you're the shrink. Although you're actually not a clinical psychologist by and large, right? Are you trained in clinical psychology?
Well, I do publish some clinical journals on narcissism and stuff. I am trained in cognitive psychology. That is true, but I do have an interest in clinical implications of my work. Okay.
So also, purpose. I have a strong sense of purpose. I have a strong sense of mission. No, and there's no denying it. Authenticity, I'm going in descending order. So I had the highest score on efficient perception of reality and purpose. Next highest was authenticity and good moral intuition. I'm skeptical. Anyway, authenticity. I forget exactly the questions tapping in. Oh, I think it was things like, are you able to stick with your values even when you're in a situation where they're not necessarily encouraged and that kind of thing?
Perfect example. If you have an episode and someone says something that is like, against, your value system or what you think is true, like, do you assert your what you're really feeling and thinking?
Well, that's a funny case because I've tried to train myself not to for some purposes because I'm so inclined to do it. But so authenticity, good moral intuition was pretty high. Again, that depends on, some of the questions were about, do you feel a strong intuitive sense that you know what's right and what's wrong, which isn't necessarily good, but anyway, I have that. I'm
just reminded of an interview at the very end of Maslow's life. I'm just reminded of this one interview where he just said straight out, and it's always stuck in my mind. He's like, when you've been a bastard. He's like, it. You can feel it deep down in your core. So I was like, I need to have an item that represents that.
Yeah, I think we all get that feeling. I think the bigger question is the times when we should get it and don't get it. But and even some of the times we do get it and shouldn't. But anyway, I have to go to another file to get at the ones that I did less. If we want to continue this,
the ones that you want to work on, the ones that you should work on.
Okay, did I mention humanitarianism?
No. How do you score on that one?
I'm just looking at the bar and I can't quite see the calibrations, but the bar looks like it's about 2/3 of the way to the top. Okay. Or I tried to be honest. I don't think I'm all that empathic a person. I can be, like most people. I think under some circumstances you are, and under some circumstances you're not. I'm not nearly as empathetic as, say, my wife.
Yeah.
What's
her profession?
She was she was working in educational software when I met her. She'd been a high school English teacher and so on. Once we had kids, she got pretty absorbed in that. What is it? Continued, freshness of, what is it?
Appreciation. I would imagine you score high on that.
Pretty high, above 50, and the same with creative spirit. Creative spirit was a little higher than that.
Yes.
And then
this is exactly what I think of when I think of you. These characteristics.
But then,
do you want me to guess which ones you scored low in?
Yeah, well, we're getting there. Yeah, why don't you guess which ones I scored low in?
Well, I can't even remember the 10 characteristics of my scale right now.
Well, it's the ones that are left.
Yeah. So I'm trying to Google my scale.
I'll tell you. I'll fess up.
Did you score low in good moral intuition?
No, that was pretty high, but I'm not. I'm a little skeptical. but
you read a whole book on moral.
Yeah. No, that was pretty high. Acceptance is low.
Yeah, you already hinted at that one.
Now, is that mainly self-acceptance?
It combines both.
Acceptance of self and others?
This is the thing I found interesting in the data set. Statistically, the more people accept themselves is the more they tend to accept others.
That does not surprise me at all, because I've been slow to realize this, but I realized that, it's not that I'm particularly self-critical. I'm just critical. Yeah. I can be driving home from Newark Airport and see that the signs could have been done more clearly and make it less likely that you'll wind up on the wrong road. And it drives me nuts. And I'm just, I just focus on deficiency.
You sound like Larry David.
What's that?
You sound like Larry David.
Yeah. Well, Larry David's hard on himself, isn't he?
Oh, for sure. He would probably not go very high.
I really think, I don't think everyone maybe has that same correlation, but more and more to me, it seems like just the exact same attitude that I turned on the world turned inward.
Yeah, and we find that actually is a great segue if you want to jump into the dark core stuff, because that is a general pattern I found in my data set as well, is that we looked at a whole wide range of correlations of people who score high on the dark triad is Machiavellianism. I never actually said what the three are: Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and narcissism. And if you score high on all three of this triangle, you're high dark triad. We find this general pattern that those who score high in the dark triad tend to have a very negative view of humanity. They don't very high distrust, high cynicism, but they are also equally as hateful of themselves. And people might not, say, "Oh, well, the narcissists, they don't hate themselves." Actually, it's interesting. We actually asked these items like, I think people are mostly good. I think I am mostly good. Well, we found that they reported almost equally low levels of both of those things. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And narcissism's interesting. I feel I'm pretty narcissistic.
That's probably one of my Achilles heel when I took the dark core test. I'm I'm low in psychopathy and Machiavellianism, but I think I'm above average in narcissism for sure. Yeah.
See, now people probably know what we mean, by psychopathy. They've heard of psychopaths, and they probably
psychopathy is really just I don't even think psychopathy exists. That label exists in the sense I don't think schizophrenia exists. It's just it's a continuum of traits. But what underlies psychopathy is high impulsivity and in meanness. And boldness is an element there too. But boldness can actually be very adaptive. But you have to get the meanness, the meanness part in there. How spiteful are you? How much do you lie just to get back at people? So that'd be psychopathy. And then Machiavellianism is are you your strategic, long term, everything you do? Is it oh, well, it's I'm plotting it for some personal gain. But narcissism is an interesting one because some people argue that there's a healthy form of narcissism, the narcissism, maybe this is justification for us here, saying high narcissism but low in the other two is not necessarily a negative thing. It depends your kind of subscale scores, It gets problematic when you become very exploitative. I just don't suspect you're very high in exploitativeness. When you say narcissism, you're probably just talking about self-absorption. Would that be?
Yeah, and the well, for example, is this correlated? And this may have to do with my upbringing. Like, we were always moving around. I was always a new kid in town. But it's like I've always, I think, had a very exaggerated sense of the extent to which people were paying attention to me. Like, you walk in a room and you think, oh, everybody's looking at me, or that doesn't sound grandiose, but there's a fine line between that and grandiosity. It's like you're writing this piece and you think this is going to change the world. It's like, when are you going to learn? Does not happen. But I don't know. Yeah, a certain amount of I think I'm weird. I don't want to get too much. I don't want to seem self-absorbed by talking about how self-absorbed I am or am not. But
I respect that. No, I actually think that we can help sort it out. Like, personal experience. Okay, well, Maslow had this great quote that, like, the more that we can learn about an individual person, like plumb the depths of an individual consciousness, the more we learn about human nature. And I really believe that is true. I believe that this process that you're going through right now, which I go through in my own life, is actually extremely productive in the sense of, like, helping us realize there's a common humanity to all of us. Like, the more that you keep talking, like, if I just kept to let you go, you would get more and more people listening to this show saying, oh my gosh, like, that's me, as well, because to be narcissistic is to be human.
Sure.
It's yeah.
I mean, that on a number of the scales on the, like, for example, well, that brings me to a kind of, I want to get back to Machiavellianism, but where did I find this? They say, my point is, so many of the things we call pathological are just normalcy turned up a notch. But the so this guy who Morton Meshagan or something proposed that the de facto exists, and he and his colleagues define it as, quote, the basic tendency to maximize one's utility at the expense of others, accompanied by beliefs that serve as justifications for one's malevolent behaviors. Well, if you rule out the word malevolent, if you take out the word malevolent, but whose meaning isn't clear here, I think you're describing human nature, aren't you? I mean, come on, right? I mean,
yes. What we're defining is that the basic default mode of human cognition, the defensive stance.
Yeah, I mean, yes. Of course, we were designed by natural selection. I mean, of course, we're self-interested, and so it's a question of how far the stuff goes.
Like the opening of this new paper, the first line of this new scientific paper that I sent, David Yaden is a co-author on it. We say, like, to have a light and dark side is to be human. Some people just are a lot more of one than the other in their daily lives. Right. Like, yeah. No,
absolutely. And Machiavellianism is interesting. So that's the third component, because I want to ask you about this, because there is I guess I should tell you an apparently true story. I didn't remember this, but somebody went to college, and maybe I never knew it when I was in college, but he claims it's true. Now, you know who Anne Marie Slaughter is, probably. She writes, and she's like, if Hillary Clinton had won the White House, she might have become Secretary of State. She was dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and she's now president of the New America. So apparently, I didn't realize this. We were in the same Psych 101 class. We didn't know each other, but This would have been a big class. She would have been a year behind me. And according to this person,
who you were, right?
What's that?
Did she know who the great Bob Wright was?
I doubt that. But apparently, this would have been a class with at least 100 people. She and I got the highest scores on the Machiavellianism test, according to this person who knows us both and remembered it. But here's the thing about there is a very classic Machiavellianism test in psychology, correct? I mean, it's not, at least there was at the time, and we all took it as students. What I remember about it, though, is the questions didn't necessarily tap into how you conduct your life. A lot of it was about how cynical your view of human nature is. It was asking you to talk about, do you think people normally do X, Y, and Z? That doesn't mean that I'm going to, that doesn't tap into whether I'm going to operationalize that knowledge and ruthlessly ascend the hierarchy, which I have failed to do to some extent. But so is there an ambiguity in that?
Yes, so that doesn't sound like a very good test. There are more psychometrically valid tests of Machiavellianism that the psychologists use, which goes beyond worldview to actual.
This may have had some items that did, but I don't. Man, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is like an illusion I'm constructing to defend myself against being. I think
that the dark triad is correlated with a negative worldview. We certainly found that to be the case as well. A cynical worldview. But I think we need to be very, very clear when we talk about the personality individual's personality structure, and that's that some traits in isolation of the rest of the system can actually be incredibly adaptive. For instance, like, I think the boldness psychopathy one is a great example, because a recent analysis of the healthy personality found that boldness was an essential aspect of the healthy personality, but yet that's included as one of the facets of psychopathy. So if we just look at things without a context, so cynicism is correlated with intellectual curiosity. I imagine that people who are more intelligent tend to be more cynical, or at least more critical of new information, even if they're open to the new information. That's another interesting paradox. So I really wouldn't don't beat yourself up over this. And this, I know.
No, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
I'm fine with being in the same tier with Anne-Marie Slaughter. Don't worry.
I think psychopathy is the real. Some scientists really of the dark triad really do localize a lot of, like, if you do regressions. If you do statistical regressions, you control for all three in the same statistical analysis. You find that psychopathy is the one that's doing the majority of the prediction on negative outcomes in life. Psychopathy is these constellation of traits that not only are you bold, but you're bold in your meanness. Do you know what I mean? It's like you can be bold in a good way. Like there's a lot of saints who are bold.
Yeah, no, I think my view of me is that I am bold and I'm mean, but I am rarely boldly mean.
Yeah, what's your protective factor, Robert? Because you have a protective factor here. You're not, you're not. I've always
no. I mean, we all feel meanness sometimes toward people,
sure.
And I think I do it at least as often as average, but I'm not bold in a way that operationalizes that very often. I think that activates it very often, that realizes it very often.
Okay, that's fair enough. I mean, in the couple of years that I've known you, my intuition tells me that you're this that you're more self-critical than you are mean. You're more critical than mean. I'm more critical. And if a second postulate of Robert Wright, I have noticed that when your criticalness starts to supersede your compassion, you start to analytically move towards the compassionate path and suppress the critical a little bit. This is what I've noticed about you. So I think there is this goodness in you that I see very clearly that I'm not sure you necessarily see in yourself as much.
Well, I just think it has to be imposed on myself when it...
You do that automatically, though.
And then what does it say about me that I'm actually enjoying being analyzed by you? Does that tap into any person?
Everyone. I can't tell you one person. Like if I go and date, I'm single recently. That's a little, call out to our listeners. No, I'm joking. But I'm sorry. I'm a dork. But I've been going on, New York dating scene, whatever. And people are so this is the topic of conversation is always oh my gosh, analyze me. It's it can be exhausting sometimes from my perspective, right?
Is there a gender difference there? Is it more common among women than men, or is there data on this?
Oh, I have a very selected sample, obviously, because I'm dating women, but I don't know what the data. I have never seen a data point on a gender difference in that, so I can't speak to that.
Because men supposedly, the stereotype is men are less inclined to talk about themselves and blah, blah, blah. That's the stereotype.
Well, it's interesting. If you want to talk about gender differences, we find a very clear gender difference in two types of narcissism. We find that men tend to score higher on average in grandiose narcissism, which is the kind of like Donald Trump is the great example of that. But women tend to score higher in that form called vulnerable narcissism. So you can actually view, there's like an externalizing form of narcissism, and there's an internalizing form of narcissism where you're more neurotic and you kind of take all that and you keep it inside, and so you're constantly like resentful of people, etc. You tend to find on average, and we're only talking average,
that's the stereotype. I mean,
that's vulnerable.
Women are higher in the thing you were just describing.
Vulnerable narcissism.
See, I think I may have both. I think this is the problem.
Yeah, that's
I think we hit upon the problem.
So that's very possible. Actually, we just published a paper showing we actually quantified a break point of grandiose narcissism where it starts to turn into vulnerable. So at the 75%, there's like a 75% cutoff point, and we just published this paper showing there's huge clinical implications here. That when you become too grandiose, you reach a tipping point where you become a vulnerable narcissist.
Maybe I am doing this delicate balance thing where I'm just like managing to maintain both. Well, let me get clear on this. So grandiose narcissism is the obvious kind of aren't I great? But see, I don't have that. I'm not like Trump. I mean, I have grandiose aspiration.
Yeah, I don't think you're a grandiose narcissist because it'll be obvious to me if you were that like leadership, like you're really into leadership. You're really into like dominating. Like you have to win all the time.
I am competitive.
So that is an aspect maybe you would score high on, but like exhibitionism is a big one. Like I don't know. I mean, how big are you? Do you have the need to constantly be seen and heard?
Not in the way that I'm not one of these people who looks forward to giving a talk or anything like that.
Right. So so I maybe vulnerable. Like, would you score high in neuroticism?
Oh yeah.
I
would. Which, by the way, on the positive side, is correlated with your score on conscientiousness, right?
Oh no, I mean that. No, they're
not. Neuroticism is not.
No, they're independent dimensions.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought there was a correlation. I mean, they are. Are those both on the Big Five?
They are on the Big Five.
The Big Five dimensions of personality.
Well, okay. So if you want to look at the big two, so above the personality hierarchy, there you have the 5, and then under it you have like 10, and then under it you have like infinite. But above the Big Five are just 2 personality traits: stability and plasticity. And yes, you're right that in the sense that neuroticism, emotional stability, the opposite of neuroticism, does co-vary with conscientiousness to be stable. Yes. That is true to a certain degree, but it's a far from perfect correlation.
So to get back to, I do think I would be low on the psychopathy because for one thing, I mean, I gather that when psychopaths like do bad things, there's very little. They don't have trouble with the emotions that might normally impede a person, right? They're just very low on like feeling guilt and apprehension and so on, right?
They're very callous. So callousness is a core aspect of psychopathy. And by the way, you shouldn't say psychopaths. You should say those who score high in psychopathic characteristics. That'd be more correct because it's a continuum.
Plus the last community you want to get mad at you
for psycho
is the psychopaths. Oops, I mean, right? Yeah.
But no, callousness is the essential defining property of psychopathy. You can view the interpersonal circumplex. There's 2 dimensions: love versus callousness, and which is this dimension, and then there's like power versus submissiveness, and that's this dimension. So love and power, right? So on this dimension, psychopaths are they're actually here. So I know it might be, it's hard for someone to.
What's the north on the vertical again?
Power.
Power is so the vertical axis goes from south to north is what? From low power to high power?
Low power to submissiveness. So you're very
submissiveness is what I see.
Yeah.
And then the left and right on the
love and callousness. And callous. So the worst of the worst are right here because
which is for our podcast listeners, that's in the northeast quadrant. So
thank you for
power and callousness combined.
Exactly. So you're callous, but you're also calculating about it. Now, so it's possible to just be here And that's actually, there are a lot of people.
Which is just like the coordinate would be way out on the x-axis, but 0 on the y.
Yeah, grumpy.
Way out on callousness, but not exploiting people, you mean?
Exactly. So there's plenty of people that just don't score high in love. And actually, so you might actually, I don't know, but I don't know if you'd agree with that, but it's fine. Like, not everyone needs to be agreeable, right? Or like socially affiliative all the time, right? There are people who are just low in that dimension, but they, they're high in other dimensions. They're high in they can still be high in conscientiousness, openness to experience, intellectual curiosity, whatever. There's lots of traits on offer in the universe. The real problem is when you're here. You're so dominant.
Northeast. Yeah.
You're so dominant and power hungry, and you're callous. Yeah. That's the real problem.
And by the way, coincidentally, those people are concentrated in the Northeast of the United States.
It's so funny, yes.
Just kind of kidding.
That's true.
Wherever you find power, whatever cities have the power, and probably in any country you're going to find a certain amount of that. But that's all interesting, I guess. So we've been at this, I guess, close to an hour, but so we should probably, there's so much to talk about. We should probably do this again. I apologize for getting all self-indulgent, but we
call this podcast like the psychology of Robert Wright.
The dark side and the light side. But yeah, it's been really interesting, and your work taps into so much stuff.
Thanks, Robert.
We should have another conversation on this. I mean, one thing I could do is just monitor your columns in Scientific American.
Every week I have to come up with something. It's exhausting sometimes, being like, what am I going to do this week? Oh gosh, it's like what? I have weeks I'm like, every Monday hits and I'm like, what am I writing about this week? Gotta find something.
Yeah, no, I know. I have written a weekly column in a couple of contexts, and now I'm actually putting out a weekly newsletter, this mindful resistance thing. And
cool.
What's that?
It's worth it though. But
yeah. It is. It is. But when you're writing an actual column, and there's especially, it depends on the kind. But I mean, is it required that you can't always be reporting news, right? There's just not that. Sometimes you just reflect on something, right?
No, I really have been writing
try to make it news every time.
Yeah, scientific integrations of recent studies along a certain topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that is challenging.
Yeah.
But we will steer all our readers there. So if you want to see links to some of the relevant columns you've written that we've mentioned, you wrote one both on the dark stuff and on the self-actualization.
The dark one is the current cover story of Scientific American Mind, which is only digital now, but yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And also we'll link to those on the meaningoflife.tv site if people click on links mentioned. And
the test, self-actualizationtest.com.
Right. You can take the test and you will probably do better than me, since most people do.
It's funny.
But I'm totally over that. Really, the damage you have done to my self-esteem was limited, and I'm over it. But
you actually score very high you score high in the real importance, like I said, with IQ, just like IQ, the important data is in the subscales, in my opinion.
Right. Okay. And I had some high scores on the subscales.
You did, which makes sense, right? They made sense that you'd be high in those things.
Totally. One more thing. What's your Twitter handle?
Oh, it's SB Kaufman.
With one F. Kaufman with one F.
Yes, that's right. One N, two A's.
Maybe we should just spell it out at this point. SBKAUFMAN.
Correct.
And I am Robert Ryder. And let's do this again. Scott, thanks a lot.
Sounds great. Thank you.